Hello and welcome back to our course on Frank Lloyd Wright by Professor John Lobel. In this 6-week of our course, we'll be talking about patterns. And every architect and designer, they have these patterns in their works, which are basically recurring devices or recurring features of their work. And Frank Lloyd Wright had a long career, but we can see some of these patterns that show up in the early phase of his career and are consistent and evolve throughout his career. So, John, what are these patterns for him and maybe for other architects that you may explain?
Right, so let's introduce the idea by looking at two other architects.
Sure.
And these will be of major importance. So first we'll look at Andrea Palladio, who's sometimes described as the most influential architect of all time. And when you study architecture more broadly, particularly in England and the United States, you see his influence everywhere. And so several times we've mentioned Palladio's Villa Rotunda in contrast to Wright, where he sets the human being in the center to survey and control the landscape. And Wright does differently, but in this case we're going to look at something else, which is the plans that Palladio uses. So here are some plans of Palladian villas, and looking at them, they're extremely handsome, and there's a sort of a calming effect you get in looking at these plans or being in the buildings. And it turns out it's not just coincidental. Now I said calming effect, so we'll look at the Villa Melcantanta. It has to do with extreme marital strife between the client and his wife, but that was hundreds of years ago. But let's look over here, and okay, here's the plan, and we're going to start to notice something. Yes, it's symmetrical. Yes, there's a central space, but there's actually a system that leads to this. And let's see what that is. So this is an architect named George Steiny, and he studied this, and then we'll end with his take on Frank Lloyd Wright. But here's the plan adopted from Palladio's own drawings of Villa Melcantante. And then Steiny notices that first there's a grid, and it's an A, B, A, B, A grid, and then A, A, C. So we have a grid, and that says walls are going to be only on the grid lines, but not all grid lines. So then we say, well, we're choosing these grid lines for the wall. So we have our central space, we have our spaces surrounding it, but every wall is on a grid line. No winging it. Then he says, now we're going to have a portico, and reflecting the portico on the other side there's an inflection, just this little bump, and that's, gives a balance to it. And then we have our columns, and then very interestingly, doors and windows. They're in either the third point or the center point of a room, and if there's a window or door on one side, there's a window or door opposite. In every case, that's the rule. So you follow these rules and you get a very sort of calming building. So we're going a little quickly here, and let's encourage our students to review these images, and also to go on Google Image and find these images and study them a little more deeply. Now, here's the trick. Steiny gave these rules to his students, and they made Palladian villas. And very different room patterns, but always following the rules, that the walls are always on these grid lines, that there's always a door or window opposite, if a door or window. And I had a colleague at Pratt where I teach who was a real Palladio expert. He would take tours. He knew many of the owners of the villas. And he saw one of these and he said, how come I don't know that one? Because these are so convincing, because they follow the rules. Then Steiny goes a little further, and he looks at Frank Lloyd Wright, takes 3 of Wright's buildings, and he abstracts out the rules. So when, these are the 4 different ways that Wright will do the chimney. These are the 4 different roof patterns. And then taking these rules, his students developed the Frank Lloyd Wright house, which, was like, boy, that looks like a Frank Lloyd Wright house, because it follows the rules that Wright is using. So just something for our students to think about. Why is Palladio such an important architect? And you think of American presidents. George Washington built Mount Vernon, and he owned Palladio's book and used it as a textbook. Thomas Jefferson built Monticello, and he owned Palladio's book, and he used it as a textbook. So the architecture of the South, the Georgian architecture of New England, in the United States all comes from Palladio. A lot of English architecture comes from Palladio. And so I'll sort of just jump ahead for our students. Maybe part of the reasons he's influential is two things. One is there were rules you could learn, and two is there was a book. So, that's going to set us up now to start thinking about Frank Lloyd Wright and how he does this.
It's quite interesting when you're talking about Palladio, no? In fact, it was his intention in the book to have these rules and to have this kind of universal design methods, no? Because the Quattro Libri Architettura, or the 4 books of architecture, a lot of them are projects that he built, but most of them are projects that he did not build.
And even the ones he built, he fixed them up in the drawings to make them perfect.
Exactly. So that was part of the DNA of the book, that this would be a book with rules how to make Palladian architecture, no? And that's why he's so famous and he's so influential, because he was able to transmit his method and to convey his method to other people who could be using it. And also he set up the rules in a relatively easy way so they could be copied relatively well.
Right. So next we'll look at another very didactic teaching, architect Louis Kahn, and then we'll see how this applies to Frank Lloyd Wright.
So which other architects do you think it is related to in modern architecture, this idea of the rule, other than Kahn and the ones that you're mentioning?
Start with the 5 architects. And there's something called the New York Five, or 5 architects. They wrote a book called 5 Architects. And if you look at Richard Meyer's work, there's certain patterns, corridor down the middle, rooms on either side, and he uses that pattern in his early projects. Peter Iseman, different sets of rules at different periods in his career, but he says, if I have a stair going this way, I have to have a stair going that way, even though the stair is like hanging from the ceiling. It doesn't go anywhere, but you set up a set of rules and then you just follow them consistently. Like, this establishes the height, so our kitchen cabinets are up here where you can't reach them, but it follows the rules. So it's actually very common, and we'll look at it in a slightly different way in Louis Kahn.
Well, Peter Iseman's thesis was his PhD thesis, written in the UK, in Oxford, I believe. It's called the Formal Basis of Modern Architecture, and there he studied Terrani and Le Corbusier, among others, Mies, and he basically dissected Terrani's architecture and then found out which are the rules and the patterns in Terrani. Or he looked at Le Corbusier and discovered which are the rules behind Le Corbusier's architecture.
So fortunately, very late in his life, Peter was finally able to get those published. So there is a book on Terrania, and he did a book called 10 Canonical Buildings. And so those are very recent and somewhat expensive, but recommended if you want to see how architects think this way.
Thank you. And we'll look at Louis Kahn next.
Great.